Good morning, Prof. Asher. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to our students today on the topic of public-private partnerships. Welcome.
Thank you, Ali.
Yeah.
I'm quite happy to have this opportunity to discuss the public-private partnerships with you today.
Thanks, Prof. So I'll jump right in. So one of the themes that we're exploring in our course this week is to look at public-private partnerships and how do we evaluate them. So I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on some criteria. What criteria should we use to evaluate the effectiveness of PPPs?
Let me first make a couple of very important preliminary remarks. There have been high expectations by policymakers, other stakeholders, that PPPs, public-private partnerships, are going to be helping in trying to reduce the physical and social infrastructure gaps in Asia Pacific, or what is now known as Indo-Pacific as well. These expectations have not been realized to the extent that was anticipated. Time and cost overruns have been frequent, often to the tune of 15 to 25%. The PPPs are about projects. So project management, competence in project management, and in procurement practices are essential if the PPPs are to succeed. Often PPPs are not taken together. Neither project management nor procurement function in the public sector is regarded as of high priority with professionalism that is needed. So one thing is to look at these three things together. If a public sector wants to do any project, there are three options that it has. The first is to do the project itself. It can design, construct, finance, and then operate the project by itself. There are many, many projects that are of that type. For example, if you want to construct village level roads, then the best option is to use this method where the public sector itself is going to design, finance, operate, maintain. And that asset management is itself a project that is often neglected, and that reduces the productivity of the PPP projects, because most often the emphasis is on construction and not on subsequent asset management. So this is one part, but the infrastructure needs, the financing needs, and the managerial capabilities that are needed to fill the infrastructure gaps or to reduce the gap are so immense that other options are needed. The second option is contracting out. And you can contract out the services. Some of them are fairly mundane, like you can have the contract to clean the government offices. These are reversible they don't have very major consequences. But some, like highway construction and maintenance, or airports, or power plants, they run for 25, 30 years.
Mhm.
Now, 25 to 30-year project has got many uncertainties, many type of risks, including the political risk. So one of the uh, reasons for less than robust success has been that in many cases such long-term large projects have had a scope creep. You
Mhm.
started with a certain scope of the project, but the, the political environment changes, other things change, and you keep on expanding the scope, which reduces the financial
Mhm.
viability of the original project. And there are many, many examples where this has happened. So contracting out, and that requires the knowledge of on the part of the public sector as to what they are signing.
Mhm.
And in civil service training, often the training that is regarded as inadequate is that of economic reasoning, numerical literacy, and legal understanding of the contracts and how to do contract management. Again, that's a specialized job, but in public sector often it is not given that professional status. So the contract contracting out is a fairly complex arrangement, but so that is a second option, that
Mhm.
you contract out. The third option is what technically we call PPP.
Mhm.
And that technical PPP is that we set up a special purpose vehicle, a new company, which has got representation from all the stakeholders, government, and the other party. The other party need not be private. The government could contract with a public sector company of some other country. For example, a port authority in Southeast Asia country could contract with Dubai Port Authority or Singapore Port Authority, which are government owned. So it is not, it is still called PPP, but these nuances should be kept in mind. Now, PPP, there in the strict sense, then is a separate company with its charter, with its board of directors, with its responsibility, and it is a public company. Now, I thought that it is important to understand this background before we can get into the criteria for success. Come to the questions that
Mhm.
a policymaker should ask before doing the PPP. A
Okay.
lot of time PPP sort of comes instinctively, or it is a fashionable thing to do. And as I said, the generic advice of PPP is just put in without the specific context. So what are those 7 questions that the policymakers
Mhm.
must consider before deciding which of the 3 options that the policymaker should opt for?
Mhm.
The first is, why is PPP being entered into for concerned activity for a project
Mhm.
is or public amenity? Uh, uh, what is the purpose behind it? Often the uh, idea or the response comes, oh, government doesn't have money, so we are going to get money from the private sector to do this project. This has to be examined very carefully. Who can raise money at a cheaper rate, government or the private sector? The
Mhm.
government, because that's the sovereign credit risk, which is the lowest, and then all the others have got premium over it.
Mhm.
So try to get money, you are already starting with a higher financing cost. That
Mhm.
may be justified, but it has to be offset by much higher operating efficiencies and project management efficiencies that the other party brings. It's not automatic. The second is, what would constitute a success for PPP? And often this question is not asked. The success is that I want to build a highway, I just built it. And so that project is done, so it is a success. But why do you need highway? What is the social need that that highway is fulfilling? Um, and that social need, to the extent that it is filled, you have to weave that into this, into defining what will be a success for PPP. Third is sharing of accountability and responsibilities clearly specified. This is where the contract aspects, the legal expertise, ability to monitor, ability to take the actions when the contract conditions are being not fulfilled by the other party, all of these tend to come in.
Mhm.
We know that in most public sector, accountability is, or in any large bureaucracy, public or
Mhm.
private, accountability is not that easy to
Mhm.
establish. But in this case, for a project, that's why a separate entity whose sole responsibility is to do the project, whether it is design, construct, and then
Mhm.
operate, and then transfer the project
Mhm.
back to the public sector, that is really very essential.
Mhm.
Fourth, are all parties in agreements on the nature of the PPP and what it entails? So there is a fairly well-known example from the UK Metro,
Mhm.
when the UK government did a PPP about the track maintenance program. What the parliamentary committee found was that the government thought they were getting into a fixed cost contract. You
Mhm.
have to maintain the track, repair them, do this, and there is a fixed cost to it.
Mhm.
The private party looked at it as cost plus. So now, if you have a cost plus as a private party, fixed cost as a government, the conflict and some of the uh, disappointments in meeting the objectives is going to be inevitable. Fifth is, have the risk been assessed and allocated?
Mhm.
Have risk mitigation steps been incorporated? We are seeing how important the risk management is, and particularly what is known as black swan events
Mhm.
or the tail risk,
Mhm.
where probability is low, but if they occur, the cost is immense. So that risk management, again, is something that has to be thought about, and the risk has to be allocated to the party that is best uh,
Mhm.
able to bear that. Macroeconomic risk should not be at the private sector. It should be the government, the society, or and the macroeconomic risk should not be borne by individuals. Sixth is, will the total economic cost, not just
Mhm.
finance. And we know that a lot of time when you get something cheap in financial terms, in the short run, it becomes very expensive in the long term. And it is the total economic cost over the life of the project. So if the life is 25, 30 years, then you got to be able to assess that, be less than or at least equal to what it would cost if undertaken by the government or public sector organization itself. There are many cases where the airport privatization or airport PPP was given, and after a while, the government had to take it back and unwind the contract, and that cost the society far more than if the government or public sector organization would have done that themselves.
By itself.
One example is in the Philippines about their uh, third airport terminal. So efficiency gains must be subsidized by higher transaction cost and greater complexity of PPP projects. PPP are the most complex. They are higher transaction cost, including finance cost. So where are the efficiencies going to be coming from to justify that? And seventh, we have to remember, and last, is that all liabilities in PPP projects, whether it is concession contract or technical PPP, all contingent liabilities are going to be on the state, on the government. And therefore, that contingent liability, those contingent liabilities have to be estimated in case of failure. So a lot of time you see in metro was to be built, and you will see a lot of pillars there, but no metro. Now, who is going to bear that cost of now removing the pillar or doing it again? It's going to be the state, because the private party can walk away and the state will be left. So that is something that needs to be taken into account. Lastly, the transfer, if it is a design, build, finance, and operate, and then transfer back to the government. But what conditions are there for transferring back to the government is something that often gets neglected because it is 25 years away. But that is something that has to be explicitly in the document. Okay, I'm sorry I spoke a little bit at length, but clear analytical understanding of PPP is vital if we are to avoid many of the mistakes or limitations that we have found in our experience with PPPs in Indo-Pacific.
That's a very comprehensive response. And I particularly appreciate those analytical nuances, specifically those questions that we have to ask, as policymakers have to ask ex ante, as opposed to usually in evaluation studies that's done after the project has set to given rise to a large share of contingent liabilities, which the government has to finance now. Okay, thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you very much for having me.